In the mid-18th century, the small German duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz remained a quiet corner of the Holy Roman Empire, far from the grand theaters of European power. Here, a young Princess Charlotte was raised in modest luxury, her life defined by the rigorous education of the German nobility. Though her family lacked the immense wealth of the Habsburgs, Charlotte possessed an inquisitive mind and a deep, quiet resilience. She spent her days navigating the drafty halls of her ancestral home, unaware that an ocean away, a young King George III was searching for a bride who could navigate the treacherous waters of the British court. The peace of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was shattered in the summer of 1761 by the arrival of an English envoy, Lord Harcourt. He carried with him a formal proposal that would change the course of history. George III, newly ascended to the British throne, sought a queen who was virtuous, educated, and removed from the complex political entanglements of the major powers. Charlotte, at only 17, was chosen. The weight of this destiny settled upon her like a heavy velvet cloak. She was to leave her home, her mother, and everything she knew to become the queen of a land she had never seen. Preparation for the voyage was a whirlwind of frantic activity and somber goodbyes. Heavy wooden chests were packed with Charlotte's modest belongings, including her beloved books and the small keepsakes of her childhood. As she looked upon her homeland for the last time, there was no celebration in her heart, only the gravity of her new duty. The air in the castle felt thick with the scent of old dust and melting candle wax. Charlotte understood that her departure was a permanent exile, a sacrifice of personal comfort for the stability of a distant crown. The journey across the North Sea was a brutal introduction to the power of the elements. For 10 days, the ship Royal Charlotte was tossed by violent gales that threatened to pull the vessel into the depths. Amidst the crashing waves and the creaking of the timber, the young princess remained surprisingly composed. While her attendants succumbed to seasickness and terror, Charlotte sat in the dim lantern light of her cabin, finding solace in the rhythmic movement of the ocean. This resilience would become her hallmark, a quiet strength that would eventually earn her the respect of the British people. On September 8, 1761, Charlotte finally set foot on British soil at Harwich. The journey to London was a blur of cheering crowds and dusty roads. When she finally arrived at St. James's Palace, she was exhausted but resolute. It was here that she first laid eyes on George III. The king, known for his earnest nature and love of order, was immediately struck by the young woman's poise. Their meeting was not one of romantic fire, but of mutual recognition, two souls bound by the immense burdens of their station, preparing to enter a marriage that would endure for over 50 years. Within hours of her arrival, Charlotte was hurried into her wedding and shortly after the grand coronation at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was a spectacle of ancient tradition designed to project the power of the British Empire to the world. As the heavy crown of the Queen Consort was placed upon her head, the weight felt literal. The abbey was filled with the smoke of hundreds of candles and the scent of incense, creating an atmosphere of sacred mystery. Amidst the towering Gothic arches and the silent gazes of the nobility, the young German princess was transformed into a British queen. In the early months of her reign, Charlotte found herself a stranger in a strange land. The British court was a nest of intrigue and shifting loyalties, where every word was scrutinized and every gesture analyzed. Isolated by her lack of English and the rigid protocols of the palace, she often withdrew to her private chambers. The grand rooms of St. James's felt more like a gilded cage than a home. It was during these quiet hours, surrounded by the deep shadows of the palace, that she began to seek a purpose that transcended the ceremonial duties of a queen consort. Her search for solace eventually led her to the gardens of Kew. At the time, Kew was a modest royal estate, but Charlotte saw in its soil the potential for something magnificent. Her interest in botany was not merely aesthetic, it was a rigorous scientific pursuit. She began to spend her mornings wandering the grounds, observing the way the light hit the leaves and the intricate structures of the native plants. In the garden, the pressures of the crown seemed to fade, replaced by the logical, silent growth of the natural world. This was the beginning of her true passion. The king shared his wife's love for the land, earning him the nickname Farmer George. Together, they turned their attention to the advancement of agricultural and botanical knowledge. Charlotte began to correspond with the leading scientists of the day, including the famed Joseph Banks. She turned her private rooms into a laboratory of sorts, filled with botanical drawings, dried specimens, and crates of seeds from the farthest reaches of the expanding British Empire. Her interest was a serious contribution to the Enlightenment, moving beyond the traditional role of a queen into the realm of active scientific patronage. Charlotte's most enduring legacy began to take shape as she commissioned artists to document the influx of new plant species arriving from global expeditions. She was particularly fascinated by a vibrant crane-like flower from South Africa. This plant, with its bold orange and blue petals, would eventually be named Strelitzia reginae in her honor. As she sat at her desk, carefully sketching the details of a new specimen by the light of a flickering candle, Charlotte was no longer just a German princess or a British queen. She was a protector of the natural world, documenting the beauty of a planet she would never fully explore. As the 1770s progressed, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew became the center of Charlotte's world. She collaborated closely with Sir Joseph Banks, the daring explorer and botanist who had recently returned from Captain Cook's first voyage. Together, they transformed the grounds into a living library of the world's flora. Banks brought stories of distant shores, while Charlotte provided the patronage and scientific rigor required to sustain such a massive undertaking. Their partnership was forged in the quiet halls of Kew, where the scent of damp earth and drying parchment hung heavy in the air, a sanctuary from the court's growing political pressures. Crates arrived at the palace docks, bearing the weight of entire continents. Inside, nested in moss and sealed in wax, were seeds and bulbs from the Americas, Africa, and the South Pacific. For Charlotte, these were not merely decorations, they were biological puzzles waiting to be solved. She oversaw the careful cataloging of every specimen, her hands often stained with the soil of far-off lands. In the dim light of the potting sheds, the Queen felt a profound connection to the vast, expanding British Empire, viewing it through the lens of discovery rather than conquest. Each new sprout was a triumph of life over the arduous journey across the seas. To house the most delicate arrivals, Charlotte commissioned the expansion of glass houses, structures that were marvels of 18th century engineering. These glass cathedrals trapped the pale British sun, creating pockets of tropical warmth amidst the cool London air. Inside, the Queen would wander for hours, surrounded by ferns that reached for the ceiling and vines that snaked around iron pillars. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet, heavy perfume of blooming jasmine. It was here, amidst the verdant silence, that Charlotte felt most at peace, shielded from the rigid protocols of the throne by a wall of living green and glass. The public and the press began to take notice of the Queen's unusual obsession. While other royals focused on balls and hunting, Charlotte was often found with a magnifying lens in hand. She was dubbed the Botanical Queen, a title she wore with quiet pride. Her influence began to ripple through British society as botany became a fashionable pursuit for women of all classes. Charlotte encouraged this, believing that the study of nature refined the mind and spirit. However, her devotion was more than a hobby. It was a rigorous scientific endeavor, documented in leather-bound volumes that filled her private library, each page a testament to her dedication. As the 1780s dawned, a shadow fell over the royal household. King George III's health began to falter, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The halls of Windsor and Kew, once filled with the sounds of family life, grew quiet and tense. Charlotte found her plants to be her greatest comfort during these turbulent times. While the king's mind wandered into darkness, the queen sought solace in the predictable cycles of growth and decay. In the garden, the seasons followed a logical order that the world of politics and palace intrigue lacked. Her botanical studies became a fortress against the encroaching chaos of the king's illness. Sleep often eluded Charlotte as the king's episodes grew more frequent. She would retreat to her study at midnight, the only sound the scratching of her quill against thick, textured paper. By candlelight, she organized her herbarium, pressing dried specimens into heavy books. Each plant was labeled with its Latin name and origin, a meticulous record of her life's work. These late-night sessions were her only moments of true solitude. In the flickering light, the shadows of the plants on the wall seemed to dance like ancient spirits, reminding her that while kings might fall and empires crumble, the beauty of the natural world remained eternal and unchanging. Charlotte understood that to preserve her findings, she needed the world's finest artists. She commissioned painters like James Sowerby to capture the likeness of her rarest plants with scientific precision. These collaborations were intense. Charlotte would often sit with the artist for hours, ensuring every petal and stamen was depicted accurately. These illustrations were not just art, they were data, intended to be shared with the scientific community. The Queen's quarters became a bustling studio where the scent of oil paint mingled with the aroma of dried herbs, a place where the boundaries between royalty and the world of science blurred into a singular, focused mission. Outside the garden walls, the world was in upheaval. The American Revolution had strained the crown, and news of unrest in France whispered through the palace corridors. Charlotte felt the weight of the crown more heavily than ever, yet she remained steadfast in her duties. While her husband struggled with his mental state and his advisors fretted over lost colonies, Charlotte focused on the arrival of a new species of protea. To some, her devotion seemed like a distraction, but to her it was an act of preservation. In a world tearing itself apart, she was building a sanctuary of order, beauty, and scientific discovery that would outlast any war. Charlotte was determined to pass her passion for botany down to her daughters. She turned the study of plants into a core part of their education, teaching them to observe, draw, and understand the natural world. In the quiet afternoons at Kew, the princesses would join their mother, their young hands mimicking her careful movements as they sketched wildflowers. Charlotte hoped that this knowledge would give them the same inner strength and intellectual curiosity that had sustained her. She taught them that a queen must be more than a figurehead. She must be a guardian of knowledge and a patron of the wonders that the earth provided. One humid night, word reached the queen that a rare nocturnal cactus, the queen of the night, was finally beginning to bloom in the glasshouse. Charlotte dressed quickly and made her way through the dark palace grounds, accompanied only by a single footman carrying a lantern. When she reached the glasshouse, she found the flower opening its massive white petals, releasing a scent that filled the entire space. It was a fleeting, spectacular event that lasted only a few hours. Standing alone in the dark, watching the flower reach its peak, Charlotte felt a profound sense of wonder. In that moment, the burdens of the crown disappeared, replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of discovery. As dawn began to gray the edges of the horizon, Charlotte returned to her private chambers, the image of the Queen of the Night seared into her memory. The silence of the palace felt heavier than usual, a stark contrast to the vibrant life she had just witnessed. She knew that by mid-morning, the magnificent flower would be nothing but a withered husk, its singular moment of glory ended. This realization filled her with a quiet melancholy, but also a renewed urgency. She understood that nature's secrets were fleeting, and that her role was to capture and preserve them before they vanished into the shadows of history. The memory of the cactus's fleeting bloom burned bright in her mind as she sat at her desk, the quill scratching rhythmically against thick paper. Charlotte worked with a feverish precision, sketching the intricate layers of the white petals and the delicate structure of the stamens. She did not rely on memory alone. She had brought a small cutting back, which lay on a silver tray under the glow of a dozen candles. Every stroke of her pen was an act of preservation, a way to freeze time and keep the ephemeral beauty of the Queen of the Night alive within the pages of her botanical journal. Charlotte's passion for botany was not merely a hobby. It was a diplomatic and scientific endeavor that connected her to the greatest minds of the age. She began a regular correspondence with Sir Joseph Banks, the renowned naturalist who had circumnavigated the globe with Captain Cook. Their letters were filled with detailed descriptions of unknown flora and sketches of exotic seeds. In the dim light of her study, Charlotte would pore over Banks's notes, her mind traveling to distant lands she would never visit. Together, they envisioned Kew Gardens not just as a royal park, but as a global treasury of plant life. New arrivals from the southern hemisphere arrived in heavy wooden crates, smelling of salt spray and damp earth. These were the treasures Charlotte craved, seeds and saplings that had survived months at sea to reach the English soil. As the crates were pried open in the palace courtyard, Charlotte stood by, ignoring the chill of the morning air. Each new specimen represented a piece of a larger puzzle, a tiny fragment of the natural world that demanded classification and care. She felt the weight of her responsibility. These plants were delicate ambassadors of a wild, uncharted world, and their survival rested in her hands. While the gardens flourished, a dark cloud began to settle over the royal household. King George III's health, always a source of quiet concern, began to take a more erratic turn. Charlotte observed the subtle changes, the sudden outbursts of temper, the long periods of restless pacing, and the moments of profound confusion. She found herself retreating more frequently to her botanical studies, not out of neglect, but as a means of maintaining her own sanity. The order and logic of the plant kingdom provided a necessary sanctuary from the unpredictable and increasingly chaotic atmosphere of the king's private apartments. In the quiet sanctuary of the king's library at Kew, Charlotte sought refuge among the leather-bound volumes of natural history. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax, a scent she found deeply comforting. Here, the troubles of the Regency and the king's failing health felt miles away. She spent hours researching the proper climate for the South African proteus and the delicate orchids arriving from the Caribbean. The library was more than a room. It was a fortress of knowledge where she could commune with the greats of the past, their wisdom providing a steadying hand in her turbulent life. Among the many specimens brought to her, one stood out for its regal avian appearance, the bird of paradise flower. Sir Joseph Banks had proposed naming it Strelitzia regini in her honor, a gesture that moved Charlotte deeply. As she examined the sharp orange and deep blue petals, she saw a reflection of her own life, exotic, resilient, and inherently tied to the crown. The flower became her favorite, a symbol of her contributions to science. She spent days supervising its planting in the glasshouse, ensuring that the soil was exactly right, treating the plant with the same care she would a royal heir. Rain lashed against the windows of the Queen's Lodge, turning the meticulously manicured lawns into a muddy gray expanse. Inside, the atmosphere was somber as Charlotte received news of a failed expedition to the Americas. Many of the rare seeds had been lost to rot during a storm. She sat by the window, watching the droplets race down the glass, feeling the sting of the loss. In the world of botany, as in the world of politics, progress was often met with setback. However, she did not despair. She picked up her pen and began a letter to a contact in Philadelphia, already planning the next attempt. Late into the night, Charlotte often worked alongside her botanical illustrators, such as Francis Bauer. They sat in a pool of golden light, surrounded by the scent of dried herbs and fresh ink. She was a demanding patron, insisting on absolute scientific accuracy over artistic flourish. "The curve of the leaf must be true to life," she would remind them, her voice low and firm. She understood that these illustrations would serve as the primary record for future generations of botanists. In these midnight sessions, the distinction between queen and scientist blurred, replaced by a shared devotion to the intricate beauty of the natural world. The weight of the crown was a constant pressure, yet the study of nature offered a different kind of order, one that was predictable and ancient. As she prepared for a formal court event, her ladies-in-waiting adjusted her heavy lace collar and pinned diamonds into her hair. Charlotte's mind, however, was in the dirt of the Kew glasshouses. She thought of the Strelitzia seeds and the fragile seedlings she had checked that morning. She realized that while her title gave her power, it was her passion for the earth that gave her peace. She stepped out of her chambers, the Queen of England on the outside, but a botanist at heart. Charlotte glided through the cavernous halls of St. James's Palace, the rustle of her heavy silk gown echoing like a whisper against the cold stone. Around her, the court was a sea of bowing figures and stiff etiquette, yet she felt like a ghost among the living. Her eyes flickered to the tall windows where the moon illuminated the silhouettes of the trees outside. While the courtiers discussed alliances and taxes, Charlotte's thoughts were miles away at Kew, where the humid air of the glasshouses nurtured life that was honest and unpretentious. The crown on her head felt heavier than ever, a golden cage for a mind that yearned for the wild. In a secluded alcove far from the music of the ballroom, Charlotte met with Sir Joseph Banks. He was a man of the world, his hands stained with the soil of distant continents. They spoke in hushed tones, not of gossip or scandals, but of the genus Banksia and the strange flora of the South Seas. To the observers, it looked like a standard royal audience, but to Charlotte, it was a lifeline. Banks presented her with a leather-bound portfolio of sketches, the ink still fresh. In these drawings, she saw a world larger than the English throne, a world of infinite variety and silent green endurance. A heavy wooden crate, marked with the seal of the East India Company, arrived at the palace under the cover of dusk. Charlotte insisted on opening it herself, ignoring the protests of her servants. As the pry bar groaned against the wood, a scent of damp earth and foreign spice filled the room. Inside, nestled in layers of dried moss, were the bulbs of rare lilies from the Himalayas. Her fingers, usually adorned with the finest rings, were soon smudged with dark, rich soil. This was her true wealth. Every new specimen was a piece of a puzzle she was determined to solve, a fragment of a global map written in petals. Late into the night, the Queen's private study became a sanctuary of science. By the light of a single guttering candle, she compared the new specimens with the ancient texts of Linnaeus. The scratching of her quill was the only sound in the silent palace. She was not merely a collector, she was a student of the Enlightenment, cataloguing the nuances of stamen and pistil with the precision of a scholar. The pressure of the king's erratic health and the political instability of the colonies weighed on her, but here, within the margins of her botanical journals, she found a logic that the world of men lacked. The king's health began to falter, his mind drifting into shadows that Charlotte could not reach. As the palace grew thick with the whispers of physicians and nervous ministers, Charlotte retreated more frequently to the gardens of Kew. The plants did not judge, nor did they demand explanations for the king's madness. Among the exotic ferns and the towering palms, she found a stillness that allowed her to breathe. The garden was her fortress, a living wall against the chaos of the Regency crisis. She watched the slow growth of a tropical vine, drawing strength from its persistent, silent climb toward the light. As winter gripped the British Isles, the struggle to keep the exotic collection alive became an obsession. Charlotte moved through the glasshouses at midnight, checking the temperatures and the humidity levels herself. The orange glow of the furnace cast long, flickering shadows against the frosted glass. She felt a kinship with these displaced plants. Like her, they had been brought from far-off lands to survive in a climate that was often cold and unforgiving. Each surviving leaf was a victory over the elements, a testament to her care and her refusal to let the beauty she had gathered wither away. Charlotte began to produce her own botanical illustrations, her hand steady and her eye keen. She sat for hours, capturing the minute details of a South African protea. She understood that these drawings would outlive her, serving as a permanent record of the world's hidden wonders. In the precision of her strokes, there was a sense of control that she lacked in her public life. While the newspapers debated her influence and the king's fitness to rule, Charlotte focused on the exact shade of crimson in a petal. For her, art was not a hobby, but a rigorous documentation of God's creation. During a tense meeting of the Privy Council, the Queen sat silently, her presence often ignored by men who saw her only as a mother or a consort. However, her knowledge of botany gave her a unique perspective on the empire's expansion. When they spoke of trade routes and territory, she thought of the medicinal plants, the timber, and the crops that could sustain or destroy a nation. She realized that the true power of the British Crown lay not just in its armies, but in its ability to harness the natural world. Her silent observations were sharp, her mind mapping the globe through its flora. The arrival of a new shipment of seeds from Australia brought a brief moment of joy to the somber palace. Charlotte spent the afternoon sorting through the tiny, dark specks, each one containing the blueprint for a giant tree or a delicate wildflower. She felt like a guardian of the future, holding life that would bloom long after she was gone. The weight of the king's illness and the demands of the state were momentarily forgotten. In the quiet of her seed room, surrounded by drawers of dried specimens and jars of earth, Charlotte was not a queen, but a pioneer of the natural world. One evening, as a storm rattled the palace windows, Charlotte discovered a rare bloom in her private conservatory, a flower that only opened in the deepest night. Its petals were a pale, luminous white against the dark greenery, and its scent was intoxicating. In that moment of solitary triumph, she felt a profound connection to the earth. The crown, the court, and the burdens of her station seemed small compared to the silent miracle of this single flower. She stood in the dark, a witness to a beauty that required no audience, finding peace in the quiet mystery of the natural world. As dawn broke over the palace, the ethereal glow of the night-blooming flower began to fade, but Charlotte's resolve did not. She moved to her writing desk, the scratching of her quill the only sound in the cavernous room. Her notes were meticulous, capturing every curve of the petal and every nuance of the scent before they vanished into memory. The queen realized that her botanical pursuits were no longer a mere hobby. They were a silent chronicle of a world often ignored by the men who governed it. Through her records, these fragile lives would achieve a form of immortality, preserved against the passage of time. Weeks later, a heavy wax-sealed crate arrived from the docks of London, bearing the marks of a long voyage across the Atlantic. Inside, packed in damp moss and layered within wooden slats, lay specimens from the colonies that few in England had ever seen. Charlotte oversaw the unboxing personally, her eyes bright with a hunger for knowledge that the court's gossip could never satisfy. Each plant represented a piece of a distant, untamed land brought to the heart of the empire. As she touched the strange, leathery leaves, she felt the weight of the world's vastness pressing against the walls of her structured royal life. While her gardens flourished, a shadow began to lengthen over the king's health. George's moods grew unpredictable, his mind occasionally wandering into thickets where Charlotte could not follow. During these periods of instability, Charlotte sought refuge in the Kew laboratories, surrounding herself with the cold, logical classification of Linnaean systems. The order of the natural world provided a necessary counterweight to the mounting chaos of the Regency crisis. In the quiet company of her herbarium sheets, she could maintain the illusion of control, even as the stability of the British throne felt increasingly precarious and brittle under the weight of the crown. The Queen's devotion to Kew transformed the gardens into a global epicenter for botanical science. She was not merely a patron, but a collaborator, often seen walking the grounds in the early morning fog, accompanied by her head gardeners. They spoke of soil acidity and drainage, as if discussing the movement of armies. To Charlotte, the gardens were a living map of the British Empire's reach. Every rare shrub and exotic tree was a testament to the explorers who braved the seas. In the mist-shrouded landscape of Kew, the Queen found a sanctuary where the rigid hierarchies of the court were replaced by the organic laws of growth and decay. Sir Joseph Banks, the renowned botanist and explorer, became a frequent visitor to the Queen's private chambers. Their meetings were characterized by a mutual respect that transcended social rank. Banks brought tales of the South Seas and sketches of flora from New South Wales, fueling Charlotte's imagination. Together they pored over maps and dried specimens, their conversations whispered as if they were sharing state secrets. For Charlotte, these meetings were a window into a world of adventure she would never experience firsthand. In the flickering candlelight, the specimens on the table seemed to pulse with the life of the far-off lands from which they had been taken. One particular specimen from the Cape of Good Hope caught the Queen's attention, a plant with vibrant orange and blue petals that resembled the plumage of a tropical bird. Banks suggested it be named in her honor, Strelitzia reginae. Charlotte looked at the flower, its sharp angles and bold colors, a stark contrast to the soft English roses of her youth. In this naming, her lineage and her passion were finally fused. The flower would carry her family name, Mecklenburg-Strelitz, across the scientific world. It was a legacy built not on bloodlines or conquests, but on the enduring beauty of a plant that looked as though it were ready to take flight. Late into the night, Charlotte often found herself alone in the palace library. The only sound, the rustle of paper, and the occasional pop of a dying ember in the fireplace. She was working on her own botanical illustrations, her hand guided by years of observation. The ink was dark and permanent, staining the parchment with the shapes of the natural world. In these quiet hours, the pressures of the Regency and the King's deteriorating health felt a world away. She was not a queen or a wife in these moments. She was a witness to the intricate design of creation, finding a somber peace in the precision required by her art. The court was not always kind to the Queen's interests. Some courtiers whispered that her obsession with weeds was unbefitting of her station, a distraction from the duties of the throne. During a formal reception, a high-ranking lord dared to question the cost of the Kew expeditions. Charlotte turned to him, her gaze as cold and sharp as a winter frost. She did not defend the expense. She spoke instead of the knowledge gained and the glory it brought to the British name. Her rebuttal was measured and regal, leaving no room for further dissent. She understood that power was not just in titles, but in the possession of truth and discovery. The contrast between the vibrant living world of her greenhouses and the cold, silent stone corridors of Windsor Castle became a recurring theme in Charlotte's life. One represented growth and the future, the other the heavy burden of history and the slow decay of the present. As she walked between the two, she felt like a bridge between worlds. The greenhouse glass was a fragile barrier against the biting English wind, much like the royal etiquette was a barrier against the messy realities of life. She found herself spending more time in the warmth of the humid air, where the plants did not care for titles or the brewing political storms outside. As the century drew to a close, Charlotte realized that her botanical work was her most enduring contribution to her adopted home. The plants she had nurtured were now part of the British landscape, and the knowledge she helped compile was being shared across the globe. However, a new sense of unease was settling over the palace. Rumors of revolution in France and the king's recurring lapses into madness signaled that the world she knew was changing irrevocably. She sat in her conservatory, clutching a dried leaf, sensing that the fragility of her specimens was a mirror to the fragility of the empire itself, and the peace she had found might soon be tested. The year 1789 brought a chilling wind across the English Channel as news of the French Revolution reached the British court. Queen Charlotte watched the horizon with growing trepidation, sensing the tremors of a collapsing world. While the French monarchy faced the guillotine, she sought order within the silent, disciplined rows of her botanical gardens. The chaos of human politics stood in stark contrast to the predictable laws of nature. She realized that while crowns could be toppled and bloodlines severed, the lineage of a seed remained untainted by the whims of revolution. Her studies became more than a hobby. They were a fortress of logic against a world descending into madness. As the king's mental health deteriorated further, Charlotte found herself increasingly isolated. The man she loved was slipping into a labyrinth of the mind where she could not follow. To cope with the suffocating silence of the palace, she spent her nights in the herbarium, cataloging new specimens from the Cape of Good Hope. Each dried leaf she pressed into her journals represented a piece of a larger, stable universe. Amidst the whispers of courtiers and the heavy weight of the Regency Bill, the Queen clung to her scientific pursuits as her primary source of sanity, transforming her grief into a meticulous record of the natural world's endurance. Despite the naval blockades and the ongoing wars with Napoleonic France, Charlotte maintained a secret scholarly correspondence with botanists across Europe. Science, she believed, should transcend the petty borders of warring men. She used her royal influence to ensure that botanical shipments were treated as neutral cargo, protecting rare seeds from being lost to the sea. Her letters, sealed with the royal crest, traveled through treacherous waters to reach the hands of explorers and professors. In this clandestine network of knowledge, she found a sense of purpose that the rigid protocols of the court could never provide, acting as a silent guardian of global enlightenment. By the turn of the century, Kew Gardens had become a living museum of the British Empire's reach, curated under Charlotte's watchful eye. She walked the gravel paths not as a monarch, but as a student, questioning the head gardeners about the survival rates of tropical flora in the damp English climate. The gardens were her sanctuary, a place where the air smelled of damp earth and exotic blooms rather than the stale perfume and medicinal tinctures of the king's chambers. Here she could breathe, surrounded by the vibrant green life that she had fostered, even as her own family life grew increasingly fractured by illness and duty. The introduction of the Strelitzia reginae, named in honor of her Mecklenburg-Strelitz heritage, was a crowning achievement for Charlotte. This bird of paradise flower, with its vibrant orange and blue petals, became a symbol of her influence on British botany. She marveled at its architectural beauty, seeing in its resilient form a reflection of her own journey from a small German duchy to the heart of the British Empire. To her, the plant was a bridge between her past and present, a piece of exotic wonder that she had successfully transplanted into the soil of her adopted home, proving that beauty could thrive even in the coldest of environments. As George III's periods of lucidity became rarer, Charlotte took on the heavy responsibility of protecting his dignity from the prying eyes of the public. The palace became a place of secrets, where the clatter of doctors' boots echoed through the halls. Botany became her only public face, a safe and respectable outlet for her energies. She focused on the publication of Hortus Cuensis, ensuring that the scientific legacy of the gardens was documented for future generations. While her heart was breaking within the private apartments, she maintained a stoic, scholarly persona to the world, proving that a queen's duty was to preserve knowledge even when the throne was in turmoil. The queen's hair had turned entirely silver, and her hands were now gnarled with age, yet she never missed a day in her private study. She was currently fascinated by the microscopic details of mosses and fungi, finding a quiet beauty in the things others overlooked. These humble organisms, which thrived in the shade and recycled the old into the new, mirrored her own role in the transition of the monarchy. She knew that her time was limited, but like the moss, she intended to leave behind a foundation upon which the next generation of scientists and royals could build, ensuring a continuity that transcended individual lives. In 1811, the Prince of Wales was appointed regent, and Charlotte's role as the king's primary caretaker became official. The weight of the regency was a heavy crown of its own. She moved between the silent rooms of Windsor and the vibrant life of Kew, two worlds that could not be more different. At Windsor, she dealt with the ghost of the man she married. At Kew, she dealt with the living future of the planet. She found herself talking to the plants, perhaps the only things left that didn't demand something from her. Her botany was no longer just a passion, it was her conversation with God and the universe. Charlotte's legacy began to solidify as Kew Gardens gained international fame as a center of scientific excellence. Travelers from the Americas and Asia sent her specimens, recognizing her as one of the preeminent botanical patrons of the age. She took pride in the fact that her gardens were contributing to the global understanding of agriculture and medicine. Even as the Napoleonic Wars reached their climax, the Queen's quiet work ensured that England remained a hub of intellectual progress. She saw her plants as diplomats, silent ambassadors that could bridge cultures and eras long after the cannons had fallen silent and the treaties were signed. As she neared her final active days wandering the great pagoda at Kew, reflecting on the transient nature of power, she realized that the empires of men were like the seasons. They rose in glory and fell in winter. However, the seeds she had planted would continue to cycle, dormant but alive, waiting for their time to bloom again. She felt a profound peace, knowing that while her name might be a footnote in the history of wars and politics, her soul would live on in the fragrance of the roses and the strange, beautiful shapes of the strelitzia that would forever grace the gardens she loved. As the winter of 1818 approached, Queen Charlotte's health began to fail rapidly. The once vibrant monarch, who had weathered the storms of her husband's madness and the rigors of statehood, found her strength fading like the autumn leaves she so meticulously catalogued. Within the walls of Dutch House at Kew, she retreated into a world of shadows and memories. Her breath grew shallow, yet her mind remained tethered to the soil. She spent hours staring out at the frost-covered gardens, her hands now gnarled and frail, tracing the patterns on her favorite botanical sketches, clinging to the beauty of the natural world one last time. Recognizing that her time was short, Charlotte summoned her remaining energy to ensure the future of her botanical legacy. She dictated letters to her children and her trusted advisors, emphasizing that the gardens at Kew were not merely royal playthings, but a sanctuary for the world's knowledge.
even as the flickering candlelight in her chamber cast long, dancing shadows against the heavy velvet curtains. She insisted on precision. Every specimen was to be protected, every rare seed preserved. Her voice, though a mere whisper, carried the weight of a queen who knew that true immortality lay in what one leaves behind for others to nurture.
Outside the palace, the kingdom held its breath. Reports of the Queen's declining health spread through the foggy streets of London and into the quiet hamlets of the countryside. In the corridors of power, there was a solemn realization that an era was ending. Charlotte had been the steady hand beside a fractured throne for over 50 years. As the winds of November howled through the leafless oaks of Kew, the palace staff moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by heavy rugs. The vibrant colors of the court had been replaced by the gray and black of mourning, reflecting the somber mood of a nation preparing to say goodbye. In her final days, Charlotte requested to be carried to the edge of the gardens she had spent a lifetime cultivating. Wrapped in heavy furs, she looked upon the dormant greenhouses, their glass panes clouded with mist. She remembered the heat of the tropical houses and the scent of earth after a summer rain. Though the flowers were sleeping, she could feel their presence beneath the cold ground. She whispered a final blessing to the Strelitzia, the bird of paradise flower that bore her family name. It was a silent pact between the Queen and the earth. She would return to the dust, and they would rise again. On the evening of November 17th, 1818, the air inside Kew Palace grew still. The Prince Regent, later George IV, sat at his mother's bedside, holding her hand. The room was a sanctuary of quietude, lit only by the soft glow of a dying fire. Charlotte's breathing became rhythmic and slow, a final echo of the seasons she had so loved. She looked at the faces of her children, seeing in them the continuation of her own life's work. There was no fear in her eyes, only the deep, quiet exhaustion of a traveler who had finally reached the end of a long and meaningful journey. As the clock struck the hour, Queen Charlotte drew her final breath. The transition was as gentle as a petal falling from a rose. In that moment, the heavy burden of the crown slipped away, leaving only the woman who had found her greatest joy in the simple act of watching a seed sprout. The room remained silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of the wind in the trees. The Botany Queen was gone, but the roots she had planted in the heart of British science and culture were deep and unshakable. News of the Queen's death traveled across the empire, reaching the botanists she had patronized in distant lands. In Cape Town, explorers paused in their search for new species. In Kew, the gardeners worked with heavy hearts. Charlotte was not just a queen, she was a pioneer who had bridged the gap between royalty and the rigorous study of nature. Her funeral was a grand affair, yet those who knew her best understood that her true memorial was not in the stone vaults of Windsor, but in every blooming orchid and every meticulously labeled herbarium sheet that now resided in the world's great collections. The winter following her death was harsh, covering Kew in a thick blanket of snow. To many, the gardens looked desolate without their patroness. Yet, beneath the frozen surface, the work she had initiated continued. The seeds she had ordered from the furthest corners of the globe were being prepared for the spring. Her daughters, particularly Princess Augusta, took up the mantle of caring for the gardens, ensuring that the Queen's botanical notes were organized and preserved.
The spirit of Charlotte remained in the air, a persistent fragrance that refused to fade even in the coldest of seasons.
Decades later, historians and botanists would rediscover the depth of Charlotte's contributions. Tucked away in the royal archives were thousands of pages of her observations, drawings, and correspondence with the greatest scientific minds of the Enlightenment. These were not the musings of a dilettante, but the records of a serious scholar. Her work helped to establish Kew as the preeminent botanical institution in the world. Each time a scientist studied a rare plant first introduced by her, Charlotte was there, invisible yet essential, her legacy woven into the very DNA of modern botany. As the sun rose on a new century, the Strelitzia reginae, the bird of paradise, bloomed in gardens across the globe, a living testament to a queen who saw the divine in the structure of a flower. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz had redefined what it meant to be a royal consort, finding power not in politics but in the preservation of life itself. Her story remains a testament to the idea that while kings and empires may pass into legend, the beauty of the natural world, nurtured by a passionate soul, is eternal. She was the queen who loved botany, and through her plants she would never truly die. By the late 1780s, the golden era of the court began to dim as the king's health wavered, yet Charlotte found a steadfast anchor in her botanical studies. While the halls of Windsor echoed with the whispers of concerned physicians, the queen retreated to her private library. Surrounded by the scent of old paper and dried herbs, she meticulously organized her growing collection of specimens. Botany was no longer just a hobby, it was her sanctuary against the rising tide of royal instability. In the quiet patterns of a leaf's veins, she found a predictable order that the world of politics and illness could not provide. The shadows in the palace grew longer as King George III suffered his first major bout of illness. Charlotte, thrust into a position of agonizing uncertainty, found herself caught between her duty as a wife and the rigid expectations of the British Parliament. To maintain her composure, she spent hours in the Kew glasshouses, where the humidity and the vibrant life of the plants offered a stark contrast to the cold, sterile air of the sick room. Here, among the ferns and the palms, she could breathe, away from the prying eyes of the court and the heavy weight of the Regency crisis. Correspondence became Charlotte's lifeline to the outside world. She exchanged frequent letters with Sir Joseph Banks, the president of the Royal Society, discussing the classification of rare species arriving from the South Pacific. These letters, often written in the dead of night, reveal a woman of profound intellect and scientific curiosity. She wasn't merely a patron, she was a collaborator. Each new seed packet that arrived at Kew was a promise of a future she could control, a piece of a global puzzle she was determined to solve, while her own domestic world seemed to be fracturing beyond repair. As the king's periods of lucidity became rarer, Charlotte's role as the protector of his dignity intensified. The palace was a place of secrets where every footfall was scrutinized. Amidst this tension, Charlotte used her botanical garden as a site for diplomacy. She invited foreign dignitaries not to grand ballrooms, but to the gravel paths of Kew. There she spoke of the universality of nature, using the language of plants to bridge political divides. In the garden, the queen was sovereign, her authority rooted in knowledge and the quiet power of the natural world, far from the chaotic debates of Westminster. The arrival of the protea from South Africa marked a significant milestone in Charlotte's botanical journey. These alien flowers, with their prehistoric appearance and vibrant colors, fascinated the queen. She spent days observing their growth, noting how they adapted to the British climate. For Charlotte, these plants were symbols of resilience. Like her, they had been uprooted from their homes and forced to thrive in a foreign, often cold environment. Her meticulous journals from this period are filled with sketches of the protea, captured in the flickering light of her chamber, documenting a beauty that felt both ancient and revolutionary. Charlotte ensured that her passion for botany was passed down to her daughters. In an era where royal women were often decorative figures, she insisted they receive a rigorous education in the natural sciences. The princesses, Augusta, Elizabeth, and Mary, joined their mother in the gardens, learning to identify plants by their Latin names. These sessions were moments of rare familial peace. Under the canopy of the great oaks at Kew, the Queen taught her children that knowledge was a form of freedom, a quiet rebellion against the constraints of their royal status and the darkening shadows of their father's illness. By 1810, the king was permanently incapacitated and the regency began. Charlotte's life became one of quiet, dignified mourning for the man her husband used to be. She spent more time at Frogmore House, a retreat she had transformed into a botanical paradise. Here she could escape the Regency Court's scandals and excesses. Frogmore became her laboratory and her legacy. She oversaw the planting of thousands of new species, creating a landscape that reflected her soul, ordered, scientific, yet deeply poetic. In the twilight of her life, the Queen found that while her crown felt heavy, her trowel felt light. Even as her own health began to fail, Charlotte's mind remained sharp. She continued to receive botanical samples from the farthest reaches of the British Empire. Scientists from across Europe sought her opinion on classification. She had become a matriarch of science, a woman whose influence stretched far beyond the palace walls. In her final years, she was often seen being wheeled through the gardens at Kew, her eyes still sparkling with curiosity at the sight of a new bloom. She knew her time was short, but she found peace in the knowledge that her gardens would continue to grow long after she was gone. The Queen's final journals are a testament to a life lived in harmony with nature. Her handwriting, though shaky, never lost its precision when describing the structure of a flower. She wrote of the Strelitzia reginae one last time, reflecting on its journey from the Cape of Good Hope to the heart of England. To her, the plant was a symbol of the enduring power of life. As she looked out at the gardens she had nurtured for over 50 years, she realized that her greatest contribution was not the wars won or the laws passed, but the preservation of beauty and the advancement of human knowledge. In the winter of 1818, Queen Charlotte passed away, leaving behind a world forever changed by her passion. The court mourned a queen, but the scientific community mourned a pioneer. Her funeral was a somber affair, yet those who knew her best saw her presence in the evergreen trees of Kew and the exotic blooms of Frogmore. She had redefined the role of a queen consort, proving that a woman's intellect and dedication could leave a mark as permanent as any monument. Through her plants, Charlotte achieved a form of immortality, her spirit blooming anew with every spring, a silent, beautiful testament to a life devoted to botany. Following the Queen's death, the silence in the rooms of Kew Palace was heavy. Her personal herbarium, a vast collection of dried specimens gathered over decades, remained exactly as she had left it. Scholars and assistants walked softly through the dim corridors, realizing the weight of the scientific data Charlotte had accumulated. This was no mere hobby of a bored monarch, it was a rigorous archive of global flora. The candlelight flickered against the leather-bound volumes, casting long shadows that seemed to dance over the delicate pressed petals, as if the Queen's hands were still cataloguing her treasures. Sir Joseph Banks, her longtime collaborator and friend, found himself grappling with the loss of his greatest royal patron. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by maps and specimen jars, he reviewed their correspondence. Charlotte had often written to him with technical inquiries that challenged even his expertise. Their partnership had bridged the gap between the crown and the scientific community, legitimizing botany as a noble pursuit. As he looked at her elegant script on weathered parchment, Banks understood that the Queen's true monument was not in marble, but in the survival of the species she had nurtured. The Strelitzia regina, the bird of paradise flower named in her honor, became the emblem of her botanical reign. In the glass houses of Kew, these vibrant, avian-like blossoms stood out against the somber atmosphere of the mourning period. They were a reminder of her Mecklenburg-Strelitz roots and her adopted British home. To the public, the flower was an exotic curiosity, but to Charlotte, it represented the successful migration and adaptation of life. The dramatic orange and blue petals seemed to glow in the twilight, a fiery spark of life amidst the dark, stone-cold realities of royal succession. As the years began to pass, Kew Gardens underwent a transformation. The private playground of the royals was slowly shifting toward becoming a public treasure. Charlotte's influence was the foundation upon which this transition was built. Her meticulous record-keeping and her passion for categorization provided the framework for the modern botanical garden. The pathways she once walked with George III were now the corridors of scientific discovery. The heavy fog of the Thames often rolled over the grounds, shrouding the ancient oaks in mystery. Yet the legacy of the Queen remained as clear as the glass in her conservatories. In the mid-19th century, historians and botanists began to re-examine Charlotte's sketches. Found tucked away in the royal archives, these drawings revealed a deep understanding of plant anatomy. She had captured the minute details of stamens and pistils with the precision of a master illustrator. Each stroke of the pen on the grainy, textured paper told the story of a woman who looked closer than anyone else. These sketches were not decorative, they were analytical. The muted colors of the ink, now faded by time, still held the sharp intellect of a queen who saw the universe in a wildflower. Hidden within the vaults of Windsor, Charlotte's private journals offered a more intimate glimpse into her botanical obsession. These diaries, written by candlelight during the king's frequent bouts of illness, served as her sanctuary. She wrote of the solace she found in the soil and the quiet dignity of a growing seed. The journals were filled with technical observations interspersed with personal reflections on the fragility of life. In the dark, cinematic shadows of the royal library, these documents remained a mystery to many, a secret dialogue between a queen and the natural world she so deeply respected. Charlotte's patronage extended to other women who shared their passion, most notably the artist Mary Delaney. Together, they had explored the intersection of art and science. Charlotte had encouraged Delaney's paper mosaics, recognizing them as valuable botanical records. This shared sisterhood of science was a rare thing in the 18th century, a quiet rebellion against the limitations placed upon their gender. The dramatic lighting of the studio where they worked highlighted the focus in their eyes. They weren't just passing time, they were documenting the beauty of the world for generations they would never meet. At Frogmore House, a specific corner of the garden remained untouched, a wild space that Charlotte had cultivated. Here, the plants were allowed to grow with a certain freedom, away from the rigid geometry of formal gardens. This was her laboratory of the soul. Even decades after her passing, the air there seemed thick with her presence. The deep shadows of the ancient yew trees and the scent of damp earth created a documentary-like atmosphere of reverence. It was a place where the royal mystery of her life felt most tangible, hidden in the whispers of the leaves.
The Victorian era sought to turn Queen Charlotte into a figure of domesticity, but her botanical legacy resisted such simple categorization. Serious scholars recognized her as a pioneer who had funded expeditions and expanded the British Empire's scientific reach. In the halls of the Linnean Society, her name was spoken with a respect usually reserved for men of science. A portrait of her, dim and majestic, hung in a quiet corridor, her eyes seemingly fixed on a distant horizon. She was the Botanical Queen, a woman whose true power lay in her ability to understand the language of the earth. As the 1800s progressed, the seeds Charlotte had planted, both literally and metaphorically, continued to thrive. New generations of botanists used her collections as a baseline for their own research. The parchment texture of her old records became a bridge between the Enlightenment and the modern age. The story of the queen who loved botany was becoming a legend, a serious and grand narrative of a life lived with purpose. In the quiet, muted colors of a winter dusk at Kew, one could still feel the pulse of her devotion in the roots of the oldest trees. In the twilight of her life, Queen Charlotte remained a fixture of the gardens she had nurtured for over half a century. Her hair had turned to the color of winter frost, and her movements were slower, yet her eyes retained the sharp, inquisitive light of the young princess who had first arrived from Strelitz. Surrounded by the scent of drying lavender and the heavy silence of the palace, she spent her final evenings reviewing her extensive herbaria. Each pressed leaf was a memory of a kingdom built not on conquest, but on the quiet observation of nature's infinite variety.
The world was changing rapidly as the 19th century took hold, but within the walls of Kew, Charlotte's influence remained steadfast. The Strelitzia reginae, the bird of paradise plant named in her honor, had become a symbol of her enduring curiosity. It flourished in the Great Stove, its vibrant oranges and deep blues contrasting with the muted English winter. Charlotte viewed this plant not as a trophy of empire, but as a living bridge between the distant corners of the earth and the heart of her adopted home, a testament to her global botanical network. As November 1818 approached, the Queen's strength finally began to fail. Even as she remained confined to her rooms at Kew Palace, she insisted on being updated on the progress of the exotic seeds arriving from the Cape of Good Hope. Her life had been one of duty to the crown, but her soul had always belonged to the soil. In her final days, the royal mystery of her inner life was mirrored in the quiet, stoic way she faced the end, surrounded by the dried specimens and meticulously labeled jars that had been her truest companions.
With Charlotte's passing, a chapter of British history closed, but her botanical legacy was only just beginning its ascent. The vast collections she had curated, thousands of specimens, drawings, and detailed notes became the cornerstone of the Royal Botanic Gardens' scientific archives. These were not merely the hobby of a queen, they were a rigorous scientific database. Her death sparked a renewed interest in her work, as scholars realized that the queen who loved botany had quietly laid the foundation for modern plant science in the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars. In the years following her death, the gardens at Kew faced periods of neglect and uncertainty. Yet, like the resilient seeds Charlotte had so carefully stored, her vision survived. The records she kept, written in her elegant, precise hand on thick parchment, served as a blueprint for those who sought to restore the gardens to their former glory. The mystery of how a queen found the time to master such a complex science became a legend among the gardeners, who spoke of her as a guardian spirit moving through the mist-covered lawns at dawn. By the mid-Victorian era, the Royal Botanic Gardens had become a global center for research, exactly as Charlotte had envisioned. Scientists who never met her studied the descendants of the plants she had introduced. Her herbarium sheets, preserved in dark, climate-controlled vaults, remained as vibrant and informative as the day they were prepared. The Charlotte collection was no longer a personal cabinet of curiosities, but a vital organ of the scientific world, a bridge between the Enlightenment's pursuit of knowledge and the Industrial Age's need for classification.
Charlotte's story is often lost in the grander narratives of her husband King George III's illness or the political upheavals of the era. However, for those who look closely at the history of Kew, she is the central figure. Her life was a study in balance, managing the demands of a sprawling royal family while maintaining a rigorous scientific practice. The documentary evidence of her life, found in the margins of ledgers and the back of plant sketches, reveals a woman of immense intellectual depth who chose to express her power through the quiet growth of the natural world.
Even today, the pulse of Charlotte's devotion can be felt in the roots of the oldest trees at Kew. The ginkgo biloba she watched grow still stands, its fan-shaped leaves a direct link to her era. The gardens are her living monument, far more enduring than any statue of marble or bronze. Her legacy is found in every successful germination of an endangered species and every new discovery made in the laboratories that stand on the ground she once walked with her sketchpad and her shears. Forever, the Queen of Botany.
As we look back at the 100-year journey of Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, we see a narrative of quiet revolution. She did not lead armies, but she conquered the unknown frontiers of the plant kingdom. Her dedication to botany provided a sanctuary for herself and a gift for the future. The parchment of her records has yellowed, and the candlelight of her era has been replaced by the glow of modern screens. But the essence of her work remains unchanged, a deep, abiding respect for the complexity and beauty of life on Earth.
The story of Charlotte concludes not with a finality, but with a seed. Each spring, when the garden she loved burst into bloom, her spirit is renewed. From the smallest moss to the tallest cedar, her influence is woven into the very DNA of Kew. She remains a symbol of how one person's passion can plant the seeds of a legacy that grows for centuries. The queen who loved botany lived a life of purpose, leaving behind a world that is greener, wiser, and infinitely more beautiful because she chose to look closely at the petals at her feet.